don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never tell me the odds.
The greatest idea in human history, the theory of evolution by natural selection.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
As a date with destiny. In order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive.
We're living in captivity, and it's time to break free.
Welcome to A Wilder Life with Eric Edmeades.
What does it really take to spark a global movement of personal and collective transformation? My guest today has been at the forefront of that question for decades. Steve Dinan is the founder and CEO of the Shift Network, one of the world's leading platforms for human potential, spiritual growth, and conscious evolution. He's also a long-term friend of mine, so I'm really glad to have him here because, as I've mentioned to you guys many times before, I really believe that the best interviews, so to speak, are less interviews as they are conversations. There was some really great stuff in here. And so maybe today we'll be able to have a conversation with like that. And so with that, Steve, so good to have you here on Wilder Life. Thanks for coming.
I love the invitation. It's great to be here. Thanks, Eric.
It's been a little while.
It's been a little while, but we're both just soldiering away at the frontiers of the evolutionary work.
Yeah, absolutely. As we talked a little in the pre-show, my biggest fascination is with one real primary question, and that is that we've arrived at a point in our civilization where, with the acceptance that there are people that are suffering and that there is difficulty in the world, I don't mean that, but on an individual basis, on the average, people live with more personal security than they ever have. They live with greater food security. People are safer today than they've ever been before, and yet they're not happy. In fact, I would argue that they're more unhappy than they've ever been before. We have more people on psychotropic drug prescriptions, and we have more people checking out with terrible addictions and checking out with Netflix, and even suicide numbers are on the climb all the time. So really what I'm all about is trying to address that and help people find practical solutions for that. And I think while you may not have articulated it that same way, I know that we're aligned in that sense. So maybe let's start there. What do you think is driving this juxtaposition between an incredibly comfortable existence compared to, say, 200 years ago and this unbelievable level of discontent?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of happiness and fulfillment comes down to consciousness. It's like how we perceive ourselves and our reality determines what flows out of that. And so it's not so much the circumstances, but the perception of the circumstances. And so what we've had is sort of an increase in media. We're always getting images of people that seem to have more than us, or something that's distracting us, something, a company that wants to buy us. We've gotten very good advertising industries at basically pulling attention towards new potential desires. And then that creates a felt sense of lack. And so, the core thesis of the Shift Network is really that consciousness is contagious. If we put people into relationship with wiser, more enlightened, more ethical, more whole people, they will tend to gravitate towards that. And so, you have people that have been monastics throughout history living in caves in the Himalayas, and they can be very fulfilled. And it's not about necessarily the circumstance. I'm not saying we shouldn't address the core circumstances and keep uplifting the human condition, but this piece around the consciousness side tends to get neglected. When you spend time with wise people, I think about we run trips to Peru. We have a faculty member there, Puma Quispe Singona, who brought a number of our faculty down. And Eileen McCusick once said, she's like, I feel like Puma has what we all want. It's like this totally love-filled, joyful, connective, family-centered existence, very rooted in the tradition and culture. And he's very, he plays with technology. He's not like just a traditional person in many ways, but he's just kind of living from this very fulfilled stance. And so the benefit is when you spend time around people like that, I find this for myself. If I read enough articles in the New York Times, I start to get a bit depressed about where we are. And then I'll do an intro call with a Puma, and then I feel like there's an upliftment. There's almost like a frequency matching that happens with people when we spend more time around people who are operating in that clearer, wiser way, then we tend to be uplifted. But that's not necessarily what all the agenda of all the different, media sources, social media sources are usually pulling our attention towards the lack.
Which is, for the vast majority of human history, we lived at the edge of lack all the time. There was no food storage, there was no value storage, there was no money. You woke up every day and you earned your survival. And also, we lived with really serious existential threats around us constantly. So we have all those old systems in us, and it's not that difficult to trigger them. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I
And
think
there's good survival value for, like, you want to focus on threats. Fear has survival value. So
yeah.
threats are very important from an evolutionary standpoint. And now that we can perceive what's going on all around the world, it's like, our attention goes towards threats oftentimes. But that undermines our sense of well-being a lot of times.
Yeah, this idea of living in large population centers or on a planet that is itself a large population center at this point, there are some strange things that happen. I thought about this. I don't know if you grow up on the Rockford Files? I
Not really, but I know a
I
little
did.
bit
I
about
did.
it.
And of course, I grew up on those types of shows as a kid, America beaming their shows into Canada. And the Rockford Files, I grew up watching it many years later. I got invited to join this little poker group in LA, and I ended up playing poker with James Garner, which was just such a privileged, sweet opportunity. He was every bit as cool as his character was cool. In fact, I don't even think he was acting. That's just the way he was. But some months later, he passed away. And of course, it was all over the news and stuff. And I was surprised at how badly I took it. And then, of course, I was living in Marin County for a long time with many of our mutual friends, and I had my studio there. And then the same thing happened with Robin Williams. He would come and do PSAs at our place and so on. And then, of course, what happened with him. And then his news, it gets out there. And then I start looking at this going, wow, first of all, we know a lot more people than our ancestors ever did. But secondly, we don't even know most of them. And we still hear about their deaths. And so it's like basically there's somebody to mourn every single day. There's a shooting to be angry about every single day. There's a car accident to be afraid of. There's a planes incident. Our Paleolithic system was not built for
We were
that
not
level of
designed for
information.
100 or less people who had a pretty low-key life.
So I hear one solution is, hey, disengage a bit from that kind of stuff, or combined solution, disengage with that kind of stuff to a degree, but also spend time with people that seem to be able to connect to that sort of calm spiritual source energy. We all know chicken and egg debates, right? But I think there's a new debate. It's chicken, egg, or soul. Which came
Framing.
first, or which one can we work on first? And I think about that a lot because I know that you spend a lot of time on spirituality and consciousness. And so if we take a look at physical health, we've got somebody who's, say, living a modern life with their modern food and their modern diseases. And we definitely can fix that with an increased sense of spiritual connection, an increased sense of consciousness. But if their physical body is unhealthy, that's kind of harder to achieve. Like, how do you facilitate? Like, do you have a priority system for that? What's your thought process when you're looking at, hey, I want to create this change? I hear you saying, we got to look at the environmental stuff, but there's this consciousness piece. How do you prioritize that?
Well, I think that it's important to look at what are we orienting towards? Like, what's our priority? What are our goals? What are we moving towards? And I think that's going to vary for every person. Sometimes if you've got an immediate health problem that could land you in a hospital and keep you from being with your family, you got to prioritize that. Some things are more long term. What I'm saying is that the piece that often gets neglected is the interior
Mhm.
consciousness piece, the connecting with a sense of soul, spirit, source, making that a priority because that shifts our relationship with all of the manifest level of reality. It grounds us in something that's deeper than this individual incarnation or this particular drama or this relationship. It's like there's a felt sense of connection. So I think
Mhm.
spiritual experiences and openings are really important because it shifts the ground of being. I was just at an event called the Heartland Gathering, which is sort of like a micro Burning Man in Nebraska. It was a bit sourced out of one man who was very wealthy, very successful, but very unhappy and had a lot of stuff he hadn't processed and had spiritual awakenings with plant medicines like 8 or 9 years ago. He's created this whole movement now. It's amazing. And he is just so vibrant and happy and fulfilled, and his whole family's involved. And so he had a deep awakening to something powerful. He had access to the best of everything that Western culture could offer. He's a billionaire or somewhere up in that zone. That wasn't necessarily bringing him fulfillment. But once he had this kind of deeper shift of being, his heart was open, he's connected to spirit, he sees himself on a mission here to fulfill certain purposes, then all the rest of it kind of lines up. So he's still doing like, holistic health practices and looking at diet and all those things, but we're not necessarily thinking that is the key to making us fulfilled or happy. Like the happiness and fulfillment comes from that wider sense of connection and purpose, that soul dimension, I think. And you also have to have a strong enough foundation of health and well-being to sort of like sustain it.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm. I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl's work, and I think about that moment that he talks about between stimulus and response being our kind of, in a sense, our last ultimate freedom. And one of the ways that I think about that sometimes is that, you have an event or you have a circumstance take place, and you might have an immediate emotional, call it a Paleolithic response to that. And what would be helpful in that moment is if you could find spirit, if you could find consciousness. The trouble is, the more frightening that situation is, or the more adrenalizing that situation is, the harder it is to carve that path. One example I think about this with is racism. The way we're currently approaching racism in the Western world, to me, is just a perpetuation of the problem to a large degree. By the way, you and I are two middle-aged white guys on a podcast. In some circles, we're not even allowed to have this conversation. It's sort of a difficult time. But one of the things I don't like about it is, in our current model of the world, if I or anybody has a momentary racist thought, if they feel a little fear about somebody, they're already a bad person. They're a bad person in that moment. Now, for most of history, the safest people in the world smelled like you, looked like you, they sounded like you, they were your family, and the people outside your village were a little more dangerous and a little bit different. And so maybe there's an instinct that says, hey, this person is a little different than me, and it's okay to feel that. But then we have to get to the consciousness part. We have to get to I am no longer a primitive hunter-gatherer that needs to rely on this instinct. I can be conscious of it. How would you say somebody comes to you and they've got this. They go like, no, I have these feelings that come up. How do I access a more conscious way of thinking about this?
Well, I think that, first of all, I agree that you don't want to sort of shame, marginalize parts of yourself, suppress them, because that tends to create separations in our psyche and doesn't actually lead to much growth. And so there's some part of making peace with whatever you've got inside you. And I think that there's part of wholeness is that I have the universe. There was Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that if it were only so easy to separate the good and the evil in the world, but the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every single man, or something like that. And I think that there's truth in that we have the full panoply of human experience, the most elevated and the most base, if you will, and making peace with that internally, that we're not defining as a bad person, but that we have parts that need to be brought into wholeness and synthesized. I think that's better, ultimately, that you're kind of coming into wholeness. And then you want to elevate from there. You want to sort of come into wholeness and elevate. And that's, I think, the story that's coming to mind is there was a story of somebody who was a black musician in the South who decided to make it his personal mission to befriend Klansmen. So he was going to meeting with these white guys who hated him, who thought he was bad because he was black. And then he would befriend them. Over the course of his life, he had 40 or 50 friendships with Klansmen and basically turned them into non-racist people. And so hearing his story or going deeper into his story is sort of an inspiration for people who might be stuck in that kind of more the evolutionary backstory of oh, my tribe safe, other tribe bad. And so you want to kind of keep, and I think that's part of how we educate children and ourselves, is we're continually exposing ourselves to more evolved versions of humanity. We want to focus more of our attention on the Gandhis of the world than we do on, the Klansmen, of the South. But we also don't want to just hate them either. It's because sometimes some of the best change agents in history are often ones who have been really problematic for a while. There was a Buddhist story of Angulimal. I don't remember all the details, but basically he was a mass murderer. And then he had a deep awakening and transformation around the Buddha and became one of his senior most disciples and advocates in the world. And so there's a path of redemption for every soul in the world. And we probably all enacted some degree of darkness and problematic behavior in other lifetimes. And so we don't want to sort of exclude anyone from our heart. So I'm not a fan of the current administration in the United States, but I've written articles about how we actually have to keep a place of love in our hearts for Donald Trump, even if we completely disagree with everything he's doing. If we create that hatred and schism, it actually doesn't contribute to the healing of the situation long term.
I agree completely. I do find something quite ironic about the political situation in the world today. It used to be that parties ran on their merits and they ran on their policies, and they might run on a little bit of, hey, the other guy's not ideal, but it wasn't. One of my favorite little political debate things is that the classic thing where the debate coordinator says to Reagan, hey, listen, if you get elected for another term, you're going to be the oldest president in the history of America. And Kennedy, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was up till 3 a.m. Do you think you have the energy for that? And Reagan comes back and says, well, I made a decision when I got into this campaign that I refused to make age a matter of this campaign. I refused to exploit for the purposes of politics the youth and inexperience of my opponent. And
That was a great line. Yeah, I remember
it was classic. You could almost argue it might have won the whole thing for him, except he won 49 states. So I don't think one sentence could have done that. We've changed to an entirely different world. We've changed where we've now got one person who's childish and name calling. And then we've got people on the other side that aren't simply name calling, they're group name calling. You're a bunch of deplorables, you're a bunch of trash. And at the two ends of the extreme, it's like, how are we ever going to be able to govern if now we have to fight even after the election? We have to fight everything you're doing.
Yeah.
It does come from that
Yeah.
position of, I have to prove that I was right in the first place by making everything wrong.
Yeah. Well, a lot of this, I mean, it's driven by the attention economy, and so it's like what's getting attention is what has emotional charge, and which often pushes people lower in their brainstem into more of that us versus them psychology. And so it takes a lot to unwind that. I don't have all the solutions, but I wrote a book in 2016 called Sacred America, Sacred World. And I actually went to the DNC and the RNC, and I was trying to do more bridge building. And I had endorsements on left and right. And actually, I was on a panel with Grover Norquist, and then I did something on the Democratic side. And I was trying to say, like, there are higher principles that unite us as a country, and a higher vision that unite us. And if we could find that, people were telling me that my book helped to heal a schism in their family. Now, that's just my attempt, but if we're always trying to focus our attention on, like, what can we find that elevates us, that finds that common ground versus just brainstem combat with each other. It's difficult because the social media forces, the media forces to win elections and to dominate politically are, there's an encouragement for people to get more and more nasty over time. And now what we're getting into is more and more fakery as well. So we're not very evolutionarily wired to witness a lie and process it. We tend to believe it. Even if we consciously think like, oh, that's BS, subconsciously we start to move towards that position. So lies are very effective at shifting our consciousness. So we just have to become more aware of like these tendencies and to insulate ourselves to some extent from the impact and keep trying to elevate our own consciousness so that we're not contributing to it.
About a year ago, I was living in the Dominican Republic at the time, and my now wife, we were on the beach, and a friend of ours, Marshall, showed up, and he was demoing some VR technology he had. It was super cool, and you put the goggles on and the sound, and then he put a plank on, and the idea was you had to try to walk across this plank, but your headphones were telling you that you were on the 60th floor, and the plank was stepping off the building.
Wow.
And so you had to walk out over, and we're on the sand, right? Like we're on the sand. Your feet are
so
telling you
you're on the sand and you just can't do it.
And so Kirsty couldn't do it. She just couldn't do it. And then finally, I'm like, I've done VR stuff. I mean, I worked in film and I got all that, right? So I jump on there, put my helmet on, my shower hat, son, and I start walking across it. And I am forcing my brain to go, not real, not real, not real. And I'm stepping across the sand. And Marshall, he sees that I'm handling it, and I don't realize that he's done this because I've got headphones on. I got the goggles on. I can't see. He picks up a big piece of cardboard and he starts waving it at me so that the wind hits me. And suddenly the illusion is complete and I can't do it anymore. Now,
what a great example. And that's the environment we live in. I mean, we have increasingly virtualized world. So much of the world gets through our phones, computers, and increasingly we'll eventually have virtual realities. And a lot of the AI stuff that's coming online is going to take it to the next level.
It is really creepy. And I know that it's wrong. Then what happens to all the, okay, I'm going to do an unpopular one because I'm not heavily political in America, but I'm not on either side, frankly, the way things are at the moment. But I want to use one example that I just witnessed on the news. It was so crazy. Donald Trump is visiting Japan and they're feeding koi. I don't know if you ever saw this, but they're feeding koi. And the Japanese prime minister is like feeding the koi. And then they pan over to Trump, and Trump just takes his bowl and just dumps the damn thing with just dumps it in there. CNN. If you looked at the actual footage, he went there and he mimicked everything the Japanese prime minister did, because that's what you do when you're visiting on a state visit. The Japanese prime minister gently did it. Trump gently did it. The Japanese did a little more. They smiled at each other. And then the Japanese prime minister playfully dumped his bowl in, and then Trump did the same thing. Now, please don't take this as any grand defense of everything Trump does, but it's such an interesting example of how that video was cut, and everything we're watching is like that now.
And it comes back to your whole point around evolution. I mean, evolutionarily, we did not evolve for the current media landscape. And so we're having to evolve real new skills in order to
Yeah.
navigate it, whether it's like being able to force yourself to walk the virtual plank. And when you know something is not real, to not believe it, or create some protection from negative influences too. It's like, I think that more and more people are just realizing they have a certain quantity of media that they can take in different forms without it creating a distorting effect on their overall
Mm.
sense of well-being. And we find that all the time. We've been doing a sort of ongoing group that's more about elevating consciousness, bringing light into the situation. And people often come every week, they feel like there's this degradation of engaging this media landscape, and then having just something that creates a unified field, a sense of heart opening, a sense of like that it's all unfolding in a beautiful way, that like if you have just that little touch point, it can reset you for the whole week. That's why I think different kinds of practices are really important, whether that's meditation practice or yoga or spending time in nature, that you're really doing those resets to get to a place, or annually, like I just went to this Heartland gathering. I'm going to put that on the calendar every year. It was super uplifting. So we want to sort of create momentum towards that more evolved way of being.
Like I went to Burning Man for the first time this year, and look, I know that Burning Man's got the good, the bad, the ugly, or whatever. But one of the things I really found fascinating about it was the complete disconnection from, what burners always call the default world. For a week, I didn't think about any of that stuff. For a week, I just sort of hedonistically went about my life, sharing with other people, helping solve their problems, letting them help, like just being in. And the only other place that I've had that same feeling of moment by moment contentedness is when I've been with any consistency anyway, is when I've been visiting with the Hadza people in East Africa. When we've been out, like I've gone and stayed with them for a week or two at a time, and I don't take food. I take water because, but I'm living there, and it's a very similar kind of non-interference thing. I'm not being bombarded by negativity. I'm not being bombarded by fear. There is fear, but it's real. And there is connection, but it's real. And I feel like, for me anyway, I've discovered that a big part of this is I need at least 3 or 4 times a year to get out of all of this noise, because I can be pretty disciplined. I meditate. I consider myself fairly balanced. And then one day I wake up and I go, I'm in it. I'm in the stuff.
Totally. Yeah. And those moments of the interrupt with the folks in Africa or Burning Man, you don't even
I go,
realize
"Reach."
how much you're in it until you're there. And then you're like, oh, it's actually dropped away. I do think there's something about these, like people often talk about daily practice or even weekly practice. I think that what you're kind of getting is almost like there's a seasonal practice that should be part of. I've sort of leaned into that myself, where it's like I've sat a fair number of plant medicine ceremonies in Peru or places like that. It's like, oh, it feels like that should be part of an annual cycle, or Burning Man, or now this Heartland gathering. It's almost like we need a seasonal
Yeah.
reset that's
Yeah.
deeper, that's like unplugging. It's hard to do with the sort of tradition, American kind of, 2 weeks a year vacation, but that's another thing that needs to change. It's like, it really seems like we kind of need to pattern interrupt in some sort of seasonal basis to kind of reset, reground, do a meditation retreat, do a yoga retreat, go to Peru, go to Africa, whatever it is that's going to reset you and reconnect you. And then that's where I get the clearest downloads, the clearest visions. Then I'm kind of outworking that for
Yeah.
a while. And then there's some degradation over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you kind of have to have another reset at some point.
Yeah, I completely agree. In all the years that Lynn Twist has been doing her trips down to the rainforest, I've never been able to go. And I know she's got one coming up in December, and I'm seriously contemplating that, because I already do stuff like that in my life. But the other thing I've realized is one of the challenges I've come to realize with even daily practice is the more I do something, in a sense, maybe I get better at it, but the less of a pattern interrupt it becomes. It just starts to become part of the
It's a new
rhythm.
pattern. It's a new
Yeah,
pattern.
exactly. And so it's sort of like I've noticed that I actually need to do completely new. You mentioned about the musician going down and meeting the Klansmen and stuff. Well, my very good friend Bruce Music, who's a new member at TLC now, I've known him for 20 years or something. And we're both South Africans. I left early enough to change my accent. He didn't. He still sounds like a South African, but he was from Cape Town. And at one point, and he did a TED talk on this that was wildly successful. At one point, he decided to move into one of the townships. He moved into a like basically black neighborhood. And he didn't go in there to disavow them of their racism. He went in there to deal with his own and to just, experience that. And boy, that story is so powerful. And it does remind me that Yeah, I think we should have these seasonal things, but I honestly think some of them have to be uncomfortable. They have to be
Totally.
different, unexpected, shocking.
Yeah. And one thing that's interesting that I was talking, Andrew Harvey is one of my closest allies who teaches for Shift. He's a mystical scholar. He's been very trusted, and from Sufism to Christianity to Tibetan Buddhism. And so we were talking about part of what's needed now is like a more uncomfortable initiation, particularly tailored to the economic elite of the world. Apparently, Melinda Gates, for one of the birthdays of Bill Gates, she was kind of sick of certain patterns. And so she said, just come for your birthday to the airport, and I'm going to take you somewhere to surprise you. And she actually took him to the slums of Nairobi. And that experience is apparently what gave rise to the Gates Foundation. It's like it opened him in a certain way by confronting him with the
Yeah.
level of suffering that he normally could just insulate himself from. So we were thinking about that in terms of like a tripartite structure from like Kashmir to the slums of Bombay to then going to kind of a Raja's palace. So you're kind of like going into the heart of like poverty and deprivation and also learning there too. So you're sort of challenging some of what's underneath. And I know you do that with these immersive experiences as well in Africa. So something that really stretches us, and that's where travel
Yeah.
can be so great. It really stretches us out of our cultural, our linguistic, our comfort zone of ecosystem. It's just, and that summons new resources, breaks us out of certain patterns. I do think that that's one of the missing links. We have such a workaholic kind of culture that we're not designing adequate pattern interrupts, travel that transforms us, something that really resets us, a deep retreat. I think over time, it's like the daily practices are good. They're important. They build capacity, they
Yep.
build health and resilience, but they also become their own trap after a while too.
I noticed this heavily, so much to unpack. I was on a speaking tour in India, and there was this woman, Maya Shahani, and she found herself in the Mumbai slums, and she found these two kids, like young, like 4 and 5. And they're like, where are your parents? Well, they're off at the trash heaps looking for stuff to salvage to try to, they just left their kids in the slums like that. So she went and found, if I remember the story, it's a long time ago, but she rented a little room and she said, okay, kids, meet me in this room and we'll learn how to read and write. And so she started, and then it was four kids, and then it was 8 kids, and then it was 500 kids. And so by the time I went there, she had a number of these little classrooms in various places in the slums. So they took us there. And I know a lot of people sort of intellectually think they understand what that means. And maybe they've even seen videos of it. Until you're standing in it, you can't get it. But not only does it wake you up to a sense of personal responsibility, but it also anchors in a great deal of gratitude. One thing I've really noticed about those type of life-altering experiences, whether it's a fish out of water type thing like that, that's shocking, or it's a festival type example, Burning Man. One thing I've really found is my meditative practice is richer and deeper in the weeks following those experiences. And I don't know that I've ever really vocalized it like this before, but I find that they become more rote, more routine, and maybe a little less valuable the further away I get from those.
Part of it, tethering back to what you're saying, is that the challenge, the evolutionary challenges of being in the modern world is that we weren't designed for all repetition. The seasons change, the
Yeah,
migration patterns of animals change, what foods are available changes. Like we're designed for kind of a more changing environment. And the modern world, in some ways, we live in the same place, we have the same job. All this sameness is sort of like it can be deadening to the life force and the alertness required to navigate new sometimes too. And that
yeah,
we kind of summon a higher, deeper capacities when we're having to figure out something new or navigate something that's unexpected. I think that's just true, and that we need to build that kind of a sensitivity into our cycle that we don't want to just get stuck in a rut. I sort of had this thing, the whole philosophy is dig one well. There's all these spiritual lineages that are just like, just commit to one practice and one lineage and do that over time. I came up with this other approach for myself that I've shared publicly. I call it spiritual cross training. Is that, oftentimes it's the new things that change us the most. And so I would do like 2 years where I would go deep into Aikido or deep into like holotropic breath work. And I'd feel like I would kind of milk the value from that and the changes and everything. And then I would sort of say, okay, well, that's my deeper commitment for a few years. But then it's like, oh, something started to shift and there's like something else that's pulling attention. And you can say that's a little bit of the dabbler instinct, but I also feel like there's an evolutionary purpose for it. It's like we kind of get a lot of the juice from something when we're sort of first mastering it, first letting it work us, if you will.
I have a distinction for that. The way I think about that is, because of course we know the whole jack of all trades, and the way that expression is used as an insult. It's like, you're a
Yeah.
generalist, but the real expression speaks of the value of the jack of all trades. And so the way I think about that is the difference between primary skill development and wisdom. And so, for example, I never perfected any one martial art. I couldn't do it. I just got too bored. I did Taekwondo for years. And long before that, I did Judo, and then I did Aikido, and I did Tai Chi. And, I can tell you all of those things deeply enrich my life, but they're not going to make me a martial arts movie star. I didn't do the skill development, but have they
Right.
affected everything else
If
in
you
my
want to be a
life?
master, you have to do the skill development. But if you want to just
Exactly.
become whole, you don't actually have to, master the skill to the highest level.
So like I made this decision. I'm going to get into speaking and storytelling. I'm going to do that. That's my one well. But I'm going to have a bunch of feeder streams.
Yeah,
The
I
various
like
different
that. The one
disciplines.
well and feeder streams. That's a good modeling there. Good with metaphor.
Yeah. One of the other things that I've been observing, and it's one of the reasons I think that I remember early on. I mean, when did you guys start the Shift Network?
2010.
So that was right around the time when we met, actually. And I remember you guys talking about it a lot at that stage. And of course, since then, I've become quite heavily involved with Mind Valley. They publish a lot of my stuff and so on. And so I've seen communities. And one thing that I've really become aware of is that something that's been lost in our current civilization is that the feedback that used to make us better, the feedback that would prevent aberrant behavior, used to be much more important. If you were living in a hunter-gatherer tribe and you have some narcissistic tendencies, you either learn very quickly to curb them or you get kicked out. Yeah, it was that's how it was. I can tell you that in the Hadza,
Banishment's a good motivator.
I mean, it's a little harsh, but it worked. And if you're in the Hadza community, they have very strict rules about meat, for example. If I'm a hunter and I go and I get something and I happen to be on my own, I am not allowed to eat certain strips of that meat. There's certain organs and certain things I'm not allowed to eat until I call the other hunters around. I'm not allowed. And if I do, I face ostracization, banishment. I'm out, right? Now, the trouble we have today, I saw this stupid video somebody sent me, this poor woman having a meltdown on a plane. She was just being unreasonable. She was in a bad mood, but very quickly the plane turned on her, like everybody. Like, lady, you're a Karen, you're the difficulty. And she couldn't see it. Like, you guys are all wrong. But it made me think for a minute that the reason she can have that aberrant behavior, the reason she can walk onto a plane and do that is because in a minute she's going to walk off that plane and she's going to ignore everything that happened. If those people were her community, she couldn't get away with that. And so we're kind of in a place now where this anonymity that comes with giant civilization means that, where a narcissist can't survive in a village, not only can they survive in our current civilization, but this current civilization empowers them. I mean, the legal system empowers them. And so being involved in a community where you've got like-minded people, where you value your place in the community, where you've got really great mentors and education stuff. I mean, that's hell, the Shift Network's the right name. I mean, that's a big part of the shift that we needed.
I think you're absolutely right. And I'm not saying we've actually created enough of that. I feel like that's where traditional religious forms are actually more sophisticated because they've endured often for thousands of years, is that they have much more of the sort of rooted, weekly, grounded community mentorship systems. We're still a little loose for all that. And I think that what you're pointing to is that it's still there's more that can be evolved so that the more inclusive spiritual lineages, health and wellness, all these transformational communities really have some more of that long-term accountability, mirroring that happens in community, because that's the other thing that happens is that, people who know you better can shine a little mirror like, hey, you're doing this and you're doing that. And it can be difficult to do that mirroring for ourselves.
In the zombie genre, inevitably what happens is a group of people finally find an area that they feel like they can fortify. And they fortify it, and then they move into that area. And then, of course, they take wayward souls in and they bring more people in, and then they start to grow the community. And there's a size at which they
These are
can
the humans,
manage.
not the zombies. They're
The
protecting.
humans. They're fortifying the area to keep the zombies out. And soon they're baking fresh bread and they have food again and they're clean and they've built this. But invariably, what happens is that they get to a certain size of the population where somebody turns into a zombie again and destroys the entire population, just like destroys from the inside out. And I see that happen in these shows. I'm embarrassed to admit that I've watched them from time to time, but I see that happen. But the joke is that I think it's actually a really solid metaphor. What made me think about this is that when you say, well, maybe we haven't done enough yet, One of my concerns is that these little cultures that get built around, say, a religious practice, or they get built around a personal development ideology or practice, my experience is the same kind of thing happens to them. When they get too big, they stop being as functional and they end up with zombies inside. So
Yeah.
to me, it's almost like I love those big things that are happening. But one of the things that I've done, even with the programs that I have at Mind Valley, is I like to take the people and break them into their own smaller subcultures, because I find that the smaller subculture has a greater influence on the behavior than too big a culture.
I
And
think that's absolutely spot on. It's really wise you do that. I mean, we try to do it with like breakout groups and whatnot, but it can be the organization with it's something we've been talking about. Is like, well, maybe we should be using AI to better organize people into like little transformational groups for whatever's getting activated, and so that people are really matched up in an interesting way. I think that's a potentially really interesting AI application to sort of have that be more empowered, because I do think there's a sociological and probably neurobiological reason for like, smaller groups of accountability, men's groups, or smaller extended family systems. And then there's all the stuff around 100 to 150 is sort of the maximum size from a kind of evolutionary standpoint for a coherent sense of community. Once
yeah,
communities go above 150, they tend to start to splinter into multiple groups. So probably most long-term enduring Burning Man communities are like, 70 to 150, so they kind of, there's like a village.
yeah,
There's the village psychology, there's the small group psychology, and each of those, there's some really good reasons for why we can only process so many relationships and we can only go
yeah.
deep with so many people. But we just have to be really intentional now, because it's not just, we're not forced into it by tradition in the same way, but we have to be intentional about creating something like that for ourselves, so that we've got our family cluster, our extended cluster, our larger
I
community
really
cluster,
like
and then
that.
a larger network,
Something that you brought up for me there is that, I mean, you say we can only manage so many relationships, and that's a really good point. But it's even another layer, and that is that we can only have so many relationships that are important enough to us that the feedback from those people matter.
Yeah.
So when you take this woman on the plane, she doesn't care about the feedback of any of these people. But that's a brand new idea. It's a brand new idea, in human terms, that you could be around a bunch of people and be safe among them and not care about their opinion. I mean, that's a whole new thing. We're not really built for that. Whereas in this kind of an idea where you might have, say, a larger culture where there's sort of some guiding principles, but you've got your family, your smaller group, you by nature want to be the best version of yourself you can be so as to maintain your position in that group. I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, and they have and it's like we have a 5 and 8 year old, and there's accountability that happens even from the kids, because I'm dedicated like mouse killer duty when we have mice that get into the attic. The mice did not do anything wrong; they are just doing their thing. I'm just like, okay, give me a break. I'm trying to protect the family.
Yeah, yeah. The kids are the ultimate mirror of consistency.
Yeah,
If
they definitely
you
they
violate a
definitely
rule you gave them, they're going to let you know.
yes, they definitely keep you accountable.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really easy. So tell me, for people listening, the Shift Network. Tell them about it. What can they find there? Where do they find it?
Theshiftnetwork.com, we've created like 1,500 different, mostly live programs that then go into an on-demand version. But we prioritize live partially because I feel like people get more transformation from live engagement with faculty and with each other. So we launch about 250 new programs a year. So it's in all kinds of different, we try to honor all the different lineages. So we've got shamans and Qigong masters and energy healers and Christian mystics and rabbis or whatever. It's like we're kind of agnostic as to what wisdom lineage that you might want to feature. But generally just basic principle is let's take the wisest, best humans that we can, create programs that essentialize their message, their mastery, and then create pathways for people to engage them. That's sort of the first phase. There's other phases that I've gotten visions for where we're going, which have more to do with community ultimately, because I feel like it needs to get anchored into local communities in a deeper way. But for right now, I feel it's kind of a library of Alexandria online of different wisdom teachers and lineages and practices. And we go deep down a lot of rabbit holes. We'll do things that other people are like, oh, that's too far out there for me, like animal communication. We're certifying people in how to actually develop psychic links and communication with animals. And there's a whole field around that. There's a lot of very interesting capacities that are coming online, whether it's psychically communicating with animals or communicating with deceased souls or shamanically working, with like sound healing and energy medicine. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff. And some of the stuff I was not even really exposed to. I was not really into sound healing before we started, but we become like the best place in the world for the sound healers.
That's so funny, those things. Like, it's amazing how quickly we go to judgment about them. I had the same thing. Somebody said to me, I was speaking at some retreats, and they're like, hey, do you want to go for this sound healing? And I'm like, what do you mean a sound healing? And they're like, oh, well, you just come with me. So I go off with them, and the next thing you know, we're in a sauna, a steam room with tiles and stuff. And then they bring out all these like crystal bowls and gongs and stuff, and they, lie down. And I came out of there, I was a different human being, a mystical experience. It was really
Yeah.
fantastic. And even now, you're talking about like psychic communication with dogs. I got to tell you that like, I think sometimes like I can feel my mother rolling her eyes.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I laugh sometimes. This is stuff we put out there. I'm like, I
Yeah.
can totally feel, particularly David's stepfather's like, what the heck? Father would be like, what the heck are you doing?
Yeah, but then I can tell you, my mom would be the first one to roll her eyes and to go, well, wait a second now. It often does feel like my dog can read my mind.
Yeah, but you hear some of these stories. It's like there was like a story that I was the lead faculty. She's like, there's a cat that refuses to get off the top of the fridge, and the guy doesn't know what to do about this. He'd normally been a normal cat, and all this stuff, and then she comes and communicates with him, and the cat says, "Well, I incarnated with him to keep him on his spiritual path, and he's no longer meditating, and I'm pissed about it."
And I'm
she's
staying on this fridge until he.
and she tells him this. He's like, okay. She starts meditating, and the cat comes off the fridge. I mean, it's like, how do you explain that?
Yeah, I spend pretty certain that we're just in a sim, and the whole thing is just like, there are these weird, unexplainable patterns and stuff, and it is a game, and there are Easter eggs everywhere.
So anyway, we're pretty open to a lot of different lineages and traditions and systems. And I like honoring the traditional religious mystics and masters, and, whether that's Rumi and Sufism, or you've got deep Kundalini yoga, or the things that are emergent. Like sound healing is ancient in many ways, but as a discipline, it's sort of emerging into a whole field. It's got this really sophisticated science wing of things. And so we have a whole certification for sound healers. So it's been interesting to just kind of also open to what the universe wants to bring through the platform rather than my original ideas too.
It's not, I mean, one thing that's really challenging in creating those kind of platforms is allowing for it to become what it needs to become, without letting your own judgment get in the way, and not always making it about marketing. Like, is there a market for this? It sometimes just needs to be that the right things come forth. And I've seen it. My own crazy example for me is when I started my sort of speaking and education path, I had a really serious set of beliefs around food and food psychology and stuff, but I didn't see a business in that. And so I didn't do it until it made itself be done. Like, I didn't have a choice anymore. And then it would have been around about 2012, 20, yeah, I guess so. That I started WildFit, and it was a hobby, purely a hobby. I was only doing it because my soul made me do it. It wasn't, no economic model for it. It didn't see. And of course, it's ended up being the single most, financially rewarding thing I've ever built in my life. And it just, if I'd listened to me, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think that's part of where I think you get into where we've got larger plans that we incarnate with, and it takes a little while for our human selves to get online with those plans too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll definitely make sure that we put the information in the show notes and such. I've enjoyed this a lot. It's really good to see you again, and I hope we get cross paths in the real world one of these days soon. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for doing what you do. It's great to see you. Bye-bye.
Hey, everybody, another wonderful episode of A Wilder Life. And remember that the journey that we're on here is to figure out how really we can take advantage of this truth. And that is that in many respects, we are living in the best times that have ever been available for individual people on this planet. And we have access to some of the greatest knowledge and technology ever. And if we can bridge those things, we can create truly outstanding quality of life. And that's what this is all about. So stay wild. I'll see you next time around.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of A Wilder Life. Please leave a review and share it. A Wilder Life with Eric Edmeades.